or rather to a bold invention of Hope's. One evening when he was at his very worst and going on like a mad creature about the lost plant, I was present in the hut at the time alone with him and her. She took his hand and pointing to a perfectly open space on the floor, said, "Look, O Stephen, the flower has been brought back." He stared and stared, and then to my amazement answered, "By Jove, so it has, but those beggars have broken off all the blooms except one." "Yes," she echoed, "but one remains and it is the finest of them all." After this he went quietly to sleep and slept for 12 hours, then took some food and slept again, and, what is more, his temperature went down to, or a little below, normal. When he finally woke up, as it chanced, I was again present in the hut with Hope, who was standing on the spot which she had persuaded him was occupied by the orchid. He stared at this spot, and he stared at her. Me he could not see, for I was behind him, then said in a weak voice, "Didn't you tell me, Miss Hope, that the plant was where you are, and that the most beautiful of the flowers was left?" I wondered what on earth her answer would be. However, she rose to the occasion. "Oh, Stephen," she replied in her soft voice, and speaking in a way so natural that it freed her words from any boldness, "it is here, for am I not its child?" Her native appellation, it will be remembered, was Child of the Flower. "And the fairest of the flowers is here too, for I am that flower which you found in the island of the lake, O Stephen. I pray you to trouble no more about a lost plant of which you have seed in plenty, but make thanks that you still live, and that through you my mother and I still live, who, if you had died, would weep our eyes away." "Through me?" he answered. "You mean through Allan and Hans. Also it was you who saved my life there in the water. Oh, I remember it all now. You are right, Hope, although I didn't know it. You are the true Holy Flower that I saw." She ran to him and, kneeling by his side, gave him her hand, which he pressed to his pale lips. Then I sneaked out of that hut and left them to discuss the lost flower that was found again. It was a pretty scene, and one that to my mind gave a sort of spiritual meaning to the whole of an otherwise rather insane quest. He sought an ideal flower, he found the love of his life. After this Stephen recovered rapidly, for such love is the best of medicines, if it be returned. I don't know what passed between the pair and Brother John and his wife, for I never asked. But I noted that from this day forward they began to treat him as a son. The new relationship between Stephen and Hope seemed to be tacitly accepted without discussion. Even the natives accepted it, for old Mavovo asked me when they were going to be married, and how many cows Stephen had promised to pay Brother John for such a beautiful wife. "It ought to be a large herd," he said, "and a big breed of cattle." Sammy too alluded to the young lady in conversation with me as "Mr. Somers' affianced spouse." Only Hans said nothing. Such a trivial matter as marrying and giving in marriage did not interest him. Or perhaps he looked upon the affair as a foregone conclusion and therefore unworthy of comment. We stayed at Bausi's kraal for a full month longer whilst Stephen recovered his strength. I grew thoroughly bored with the place, and so did Mavovo and the Zulus, but Brother John and his wife did not seem to mind. Mrs. Eversley was a passive creature, quite content to take things as they came, and, after so long an absence from civilization, to bide a little longer among savages. Also she had her beloved John, at whom she would sit and gaze by the hour, like a cat sometimes does at a person to whom it is attached. Indeed, when she spoke to him, her voice seemed to me to resemble a kind of blissful purr. I think it made the old boy rather fidgety sometimes, for after an hour or two of it he would rise and go and hunt for butterflies. To tell the truth, the situation got on my nerves at last, for wherever I looked I seemed to see there Stephen and Hope making love to each other, or Brother John and his wife admiring each other, which didn't leave me much spare conversation. Evidently they thought that Mavovo, Hans, Sammy, Bausi, Babemba and Co. were enough for me, that is, if they reflected on the matter at all. So they were in a sense, for the Zulu hunters began to get out of hand in the midst of this idleness and plenty, eating too much, drinking too much native beer, smoking too much of the intoxicating dakka, a mischievous kind of help, and making too much love to the Mazitu women, which of course resulted in the usual rows that I had to settle. At last I struck, and said that we must move on as Stephen was now fit to travel. "Quite so," said Brother John mildly. "What have you arranged, Allan?" With some irritation, for I hated that sentence of Brother John's, I replied that I had arranged nothing, but that as none of them seemed to have any suggestions to make, I would go out and talk the matter over with Hans and Mavovo, which I did. I need not chronicle the results of our conference, since other arrangements were being made for us at which I little guessed. It all came very suddenly, as great things in the lives of men and nations sometimes do. Although the Mazitu were of the Zulu family, their military organization had none of the Zulu thoroughness. For instance, when I remonstrated with Bausi and old Babemba as to their not keeping up a proper system of outposts and intelligence, they laughed at me and answered that they had never been attacked, and now that the Pongo had learnt a lesson, were never likely to be. By the way, I see that I have not yet mentioned that at Brother John's request those Pongo who had been taken prisoners at the Battle of the Reeds were conducted to the shores of the lake, given one of the captured canoes, and told that they might return to their own happy land. To our astonishment, about 3 weeks later they reappeared at Beza Town with this story. They said that they had crossed the lake and found Rica still standing, but utterly deserted. They then wandered through the country and even explored the Motombo's cave. There they discovered the remains of the Motombo, still crouched upon his platform, but nothing more. In one hut of a distant village, however, they came across an old and dying woman, who informed them with her last breath that the Pongos, frightened by the iron tubes that vomited death, and in obedience to some prophecy, had all gone back whence they came in the beginning, taking with them the recaptured Holy Flower. She had been left with a supply of food because she was too weak to travel. So perhaps that flower grows again in some unknown place in Africa, but its worshippers will have to provide themselves with another god of the forest, another mother of the flower, and another high priest to fill the office of the late Motombo. These Pongo prisoners, having now no home, and not knowing where their people had gone except that it was towards the north, asked for leave to settle among the Mazitu, which was granted them. Their story confirmed me in my opinion that Pongo land is not really an island, but is connected on the further side with the continent by some ridge or swamp. If we had been obliged to stop much longer among the Mazitu, I would have satisfied myself as to this matter by going to look. But that chance never came to me until some years later when, under curious circumstances, I was again destined to visit this part of Africa. To return to my story. On the day following this discussion as to our departure, we all breakfasted very early, as there was a great deal to be done. There was a dense mist that morning, such as in these Mazitu uplands often precedes high, hot wind from the north at this season of the year, so dense indeed that it was impossible to see for more than a few yards. I suppose that this mist comes up from the great lake in certain conditions of the weather. We had just finished our breakfast, and rather languidly, for the thick, sultry air left me unenergetic. I told one of the Zulus to see that the 2 donkeys and the white ox which I had caused to be brought into town in view of our near departure, and tied up by our huts, were properly fed. Then I went to inspect all the rifles and ammunition, which Hans had got out to be checked and overhauled. It was at this moment that I heard a far away and unaccustomed sound, and asked Hans what he thought it was. "A gun, Baas," he answered anxiously. Well might he be anxious, for as we both knew, no one in the neighbourhood had guns except ourselves, and all ours were accounted for. It is true that we had promised to give the majority of those we had taken from the slavers to Bausi when we went away, and that I had been instructing some of his best soldiers in the use of them, but not one of these had as yet been left in their possession. I stepped to a gate in the fence and ordered the sentry there to run to Bausi and Babemba and make reports and inquiries, also to pray them to summon all the soldiers, of whom, as it happened, there were at the time not more than 300 in the town. As perfect peace prevailed, the rest, according to their custom, had been allowed to go to their villages and attend to their crops. Then, possessed by a rather undefined nervousness, at which the others were inclined to laugh, I caused the Zulus to arm and generally make a few arrangements to meet any unforeseen crisis. This done, I sat down to reflect what would be the best course to take if we should happen to be attacked by